9 bar pressure is synonymous with espresso. In fact, if you're not using 9 bar, many people will tell you that whatever you're making, it ain't espresso. Almost every machine going back more than 50 years keeps to this standard. La Marzocco, Rocket, La Spaziale, Faema, Simonelli, Quickmill, all the biggest, most famous, most loved espresso machine makers in the world stick to 9 bar. These are brands with real pedigree, the names you see on the machine in the best coffee shop you've ever had the privilege of sipping espresso in. With that in mind, you'd think it must be a predestined, logical conclusion of decades of espresso engineering and research by the greatest scientific minds that Italy has to offer. Well, what if I told you that maybe 9 bar doesn't matter at all? What if I told you that instead of a magical number passed down from the espresso gods, it's just a matter of nearly thoughtless happenstance? I can already hear some of you cursing me through your screens, mostly in Italian. But before you start the kindling and prop up the steak, let's go back to the very origins of espresso, see how advances in technology got us to where we are today, and really consider whether or not 9 bar is all it's cracked up to be anyway. The very first machines referred to as espresso machines didn't make what we'd recognize as espresso today. Some of you may already know that espresso literally translates to squeezed out, and these proto-espresso machines were already using pressure to force water through finely ground coffee. Unfortunately, they were doing this by connecting a steam boiler directly to the basket holding the coffee grounds. This meant they were only getting 1 to 2 bar pressure behind the puck, and that they were using boiling hot water to make their coffee. If you know the first thing about making good coffee, you are already cringing. And even worse for those of you who were cursing me earlier, these first 2 machines were developed by Frenchmen. With these low pressures and high temperatures, the coffee that these espresso machines were producing was watery, thin, acrid, and currently there's no crema in sight. The only reason these engineers were using pressure was to make coffee faster, not better. In fact, the Frenchman that produced the second ever espresso machine and presented it at the 1855 Paris Exposition bragged that his machine could produce 2,000 of these questionable cups of coffee in just an hour. Great. This machine is essentially a bulk brewer, and the coffee it's producing is closer to filter coffee than espresso as we know it. It's 1855 and we're still deep in the Industrial Revolution. Steam is the power of the day, and we're throwing it at anything and everything to make more of it and faster. It's only being introduced to coffee as a means to an end, and currently that end doesn't taste great. Over the following decades, some improvements on these machines were patented and produced, but overall they remained about the same. In the early 1900s, though, we start to hear some familiar names. In 1901, Luigi Bezzera, yes, that Bezzera, patented an improved version of these machines and immediately sold the rights to Desiderio Pavoni of La Pavoni fame. This machine introduced what is considered the first ever portafilter, which is a huge step towards modern espresso. That said, these machines still used boiling water and still only produced about 2 bar of pressure. Even better, they had a penchant for exploding and taking out their baristas. So, fair to say, we're still in the dark ages of espresso. In 1933, Hungarian-Italian Francesco Illy, yes, that Illy, produced a machine that had separate systems for heating and pressurizing water, meaning it could brew with water that wasn't boiling. A huge step forward if you care about coffee tasting good. We do, but hey, maybe standards just weren't as high back then. As cool as this is, and as cool as it looks, these machines weren't produced in large quantities, so steam-based machines still ruled the day. So, at this point we have low pressure, hot water, portafilters, and finely ground coffee, but we're still missing a few of the things that make espresso espresso. Now, as we head into the late 1940s, post-World War II, we're going to unlock one of the biggest keys to espresso as we know it: high pressure. In 1945, Aquila Gaggia, yes, of course, that Gaggia, produced the first ever lever piston espresso machine. This thing looked insane, and it must have looked even more insane back in the 40s. It's a chromed out beast of a machine with 3 giant levers over a foot long towering over the bar. There was nothing else like it, and it produced coffee unlike anything that came before it. Using this massive lever, a barista was able to produce between 8 to 12 bar of pressure, a massive increase from the 1 to 2 bar of steam-based machines. That also makes this the first time in history that coffee meets the mythical 9 bar pressure we use today. Further, this is the first time we get frothy crema on top of our espresso. You can imagine if you were an Italian in the late 40s, suddenly having this brown foam appear on top of your coffee would be a bit strange, and Gaggia leaned into this. He dubbed this new coffee Crema Cafe, proudly emblazoning the name on his machines to denote this new kind of coffee he'd created and using it as a selling point. At first, these machines were entirely manual, meaning how good your coffee was might depend on how ripped your barista was. Thankfully, just a year later in 1946, Gaggia developed the first spring lever machine. These machines utilized a massive spring which simply needed to be compressed by the barista. Once released, the spring would provide all the pressure needed during brewing. So at this point, your neighborhood barista is still ripped, but maybe a little less Schwarzenegger and a little more Bruce Lee, or maybe Willis. These machines were designed to deliver about the same amount of force as a barista could with a manual lever, peaking at around or just above 9 bar. Now, let's pause for a second. We got roughly 9 bar pressure, though with a bit of a curve, but why? How? Well, nothing I can find in the record indicates that Gaggia designed his machines with a specific pressure in mind. The piston, chamber, and brew lever all seem to have been built to a size that just felt intuitively right to Gaggia at the time. He could have built a machine with a 6-inch lever and we would have gotten far lower pressures, or he could have built a machine with a 6-foot lever that required an elevated platform so the barista could go all Tarzan on it and we would have gotten far higher pressures. Roughly 9 bar seems like it was simply the number that happened when you combined 1940s machinery with human physiology. When Gaggia made the first spring lever machines, he just looked at what his already successful manual machines did and automated it. In the process, you can argue that he unknowingly locked in 9 bar as the standard pressure for brewing espresso for nearly a century to come. But we'll need the effort of a few more Italians before we're truly in the age of modern espresso. To put the last piece of this puzzle into place, we'll need to fast forward to a familiar sounding year and a familiar sounding name. 1961 and Faema. Faema isn't really a name, though. Well, it is, it's just not an Italian guy this time. Faema is an acronym from the Italian for Factory of Electromechanical and Similar Equipment. Wow, it's descriptive at least, we gotta give them that. But don't let the boring name fool you, these folks were clever. They produced the iconic E61 group head design, which we still use today, a heat exchanger design that produced consistent brew temperatures of 200 degrees, and more importantly, they were the first to use an electric pump to produce pressure for brewing. This is a magical year. This is a moon landing, Model T, invention of sliced bread type moment for espresso as we know it. No more exploding machines, no more strenuous lever pulling, and no more burnt coffee. We did it, everybody. Mission accomplished. Now, wait a second. What pressure did Faema set their now robotically consistent electrical pumps to? Right, 9 bar. Why? Again, Faema's engineers, as far as I can tell, didn't write some kind of 9 bar manifesto. They did it because Gaggia did it, and Gaggia did it because it just made sense. Asking why 9 bar is like asking why green means go or why we use QWERTY keyboards. At some point, someone just made a semi-arbitrary choice. It worked, and we just kept doing it. So, is 9 bar just another completely meaningless and random tradition we hold on to convince ourselves we have control in this infinitely cold and unforgiving universe? Well, not quite. So then is 9 bar some sort of magical number when it comes to making good espresso? It's not really that either. It's important to remember that the only reason we're using pressure here is to produce tasty, concentrated coffee and to do it quickly. 9 bar sort of turns out to be a sweet spot for making espresso. It's enough pressure to quickly extract a ton from finely ground coffee and produce a concentrate. Using less pressure, you can't push water through superfine grounds, so you can't produce a concentrated coffee rapidly. More pressure might sound better, but it's like using twice the recommended pressure in your tires. Big number, not always better. For one thing, extreme pressures can be a little bit dangerous, but they also introduce greater instability in our puck, resulting in more channeling and therefore worse tasting coffee. Despite arriving at the 9 bar standard seemingly entirely arbitrarily, it turns out to be a pretty great standard to stick to. Today, we're also lucky to have fairly easy access to flow control, which allows us to control pressure on the fly. Flow control allows you to get the best of all worlds. You can start with a gentle increase to keep the puck stable and avoid channeling. In the middle, you can add enough force to power through a concentrated puck of fine grounds for maximum extraction in minimal time. And then you can ease out to account for the puck's decreasing resistance as all those little soluble particles are swept into the cup. Even with this complete control over pressure, it's still rare that you'll find anyone going much over 9 bar. In the end, 9 bar is not something passed down from on high. It's a matter of historical, mechanical, and even physiological convenience. From espresso's humble origins as the instant coffee of the first industrial revolution, innovations that allowed for the control of temperature, flow, and pressure turned it into a refined beverage with an entire art and craft built around it. So, as Achille Gaggia himself once said, probably, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. For more espresso history and experiments, be sure to Temps subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.